Thank you for the introduction. As long as I don't get intimidated, I think everybody will be okay. The presence of cameras. I find myself standing between you and your dinner, and I wish we could have met under a better circumstance. But I'd like to do my job and give you a very brief overview of Korea's development experience for next 45 minutes or so. And if there's some time, I'd like to field some questions and respond. Okay. First, I'd like to present a table that shows Korea's per capita GDP in comparative perspective. What I did here is to use economic historian Angus Madison and his colleagues' database and present in the second column Korea's per capita GDP. It's in 1990 international dollars, or Gary Camus dollars, it is called. Basically, you adjust for inflation and also purchasing power parity as far as exchange rates are concerned. And what I do is to compare South Korea's per capita GDP with the US and also with the world average. So back in 1820, Korea's per capita GDP in 1990 dollars was 335, less than $1 a day. And Korea's per capita GDP in 1820 relative to the US level was only 24.6%. So it's very low. Compared with the world average, Korea's per capita GDP was about at 47.1%. So back in 1820, Korea was a quite poor country, not only absolutely less than $1 a day in terms of per capita income, but also relative to other countries, world average and the US. And things got worse by 1870 in comparative context. Although Korea's per capita GDP increased slightly to $337 in 1990 prices once again, it's in comparison with the US, its per capita GDP was only 13.8%. Okay, so you recall that the Industrial Revolution was happening in Western Europe and its offshoots like the United States. And while these countries were industrializing, Korea was falling behind, relatively speaking. And compared with the world average too, Korea's per capita GDP had fallen behind, only 38.1%. Okay. Now, Korea was annexed by Japan in 1910. And by this time, modernization was a big challenge for Korea, but Korea did not do a good job and had fallen a victim to imperialist aggression, basically. And by this time, Korea's per capita GDP had risen to $485, but in relative terms to the US level, it was 9.2%, less than 1/10 of the level. So, in that era, a lot of countries in Africa and Asia were being colonized, and Korea was no exception in that regard. And Korea suffered a Japanese colonial occupation for the next 35 years, so until 1945. And when it was liberated in 1945, at the end of World War II, Korea was still not in a good place, okay? Compared with the US per capita income, Korea's per capita income in 1950, 5 years after Korea's liberation, was only 8.9%. Okay, so it was a very poor country, and contemporaries in the 1950s thought Korea was a hopeless country, especially due to the fact that there was a Korean War. There was the Korean War that lasted 3 years, from 1950 to 1953. So there was a lot of devastation from the war. There was a lot of corruption and political turbulence, and a lot of aid workers in the 1950s thought Korea was a basket case. Okay? And in 1960, as you see here, Korea's per capita GDP had risen to a little over $1,000, 1226. But with respect to, or in comparison with the US per capita GDP, was only 10.8%. So progress was very minimal. And it was no wonder that outside observers thought Korea was a hopeless case. Okay? But as you see here, by 1970, Korea's per capita GDP was at 14.4% of the US level. By 1980, it was 22.1%. And in comparison with the world average, it was close to parity, 91.2%. And by 1990, Korea's per capita GDP was 37.5% of the US level and was in excess of the world average, 169.0%. And in the last row, you see that in 2010, Korea's per capita GDP had risen all the way to 71.2% of the US level and almost 3 times the world average. So a lot of people call this transformation, the rapid ascent of Korea's economy and nation as a whole, a miracle. But the miracle did not happen miraculously. It took a lot of hard work, a lot of trial and error, and some sacrifice, and good strategy as well. So I'd like to talk about that in the next 40 minutes or so. But before going there, I'd like to talk first about Korea's poverty as well. What you just saw was per capita GDP, which is the average level of income, if you will. But to calculate poverty rate, you have to know the distribution of income and have to have household surveys. Okay? You have to establish some absolute poverty line, right? And then figure out how many households are below that poverty line, right? And if you apply, following a standard practice, of establishing the absolute poverty line by applying about 2,100 kilocalories per day. It's a recommended daily intake, and using what is called the Angus law, meaning that poorer families tend to spend a much higher portion of their income and expenditure on food, and establish poor persons or poor families' income. You see that Korea's poverty rate in 1965 was quite high. 40.9% of the families or the households were below the poverty line. Okay? In urban areas, it was 54.9%. In rural areas, it was somewhat below that, 35.8%. But there's a problem with measurement there because in rural household income surveys of the time, Korean government excluded landless peasants and farming households with a very small landholding. So the poorest members of rural areas are excluded from this poverty rate calculation. So it's probably safe to say the poverty rate as a whole was not 40.9% in 1965, but something like 50%. Okay? So half the households in the country were below the absolute poverty line. But things changed quite dynamically over the next 20 years or so. In 1970, as you see, poverty rate as a whole dropped to 23.4%. And the decline was dramatic, or the improvement was dramatic in urban areas as industrialization proceeded. So from 54.9% in 1965, it dropped to 16.2%. Okay? And in the first half of the 1970s, not only did urban areas make some progress, but also rural areas greatly reduced poverty. What happened was there was a rural development program called the Semalundong, and complemented with some fiscal measures. But also there was a lot of rural to urban migration. So poor people, especially young people, migrated to cities to find jobs and so on. So rural poverty rate declined from 35.8% in 1965 all the way to 11.7% in 1976. And by 1980, the poverty rate had fallen below 10%. Okay. So not only in terms of average income, but in terms of poverty, Korea made a lot of progress. Okay. So what's the secret to Korea's development experience? My view is that it's not so different from the historical experience of advanced industrial countries, especially countries like the United States, Germany, and others, who were sort of latecomers trying to catch up with Britain in the 19th century. Big difference is that because Korea had a small domestic market, it relied much more heavily on exports. Right? But in terms of other things Korea did, I think there are a lot of similarities between Korea and earlier industrializers. Okay. There was a critical combination of state and market mechanism. There was the emergence of a state effective enough, strong enough to maintain stability and address coordination and innovation challenges. This is important because in many developing countries, state is not strong enough or effective enough to even maintain stability. And when things are unstable, it's very difficult to achieve economic and social development. Also, when the state is very ineffective, it's not going to address some market failures, like coordination failures and innovation failures. And you have to have a state effective enough to do both, maintain stability and address coordination and innovation challenges. And this came about through huge political change as well as administrative reform following the political change. The second important factor, as I mentioned, was the market mechanism. And it's the use of a performance-based reward and discipline mechanism. Basically, the idea is this. If a state is strong enough to maintain stability and address market failures, it may just arbitrarily exercise its power and maybe actually engage in corruption. Okay? And politicians may award their cronies based on hometown ties or other ties. But in Korea's case, you had the state strong enough to maintain stability and address market failures, but also applied an impersonal principle based on performance. So if you perform well, if you're a company and if you do well on exports, say, then you receive more support from the government. Okay? And if you don't do so, you may be cut off from receiving government support. Now, if you think about it, this seems quite obvious, right? But in most political arrangements, support often goes to poorly performing people and firms based on their political ties and so on. And by making opportunity available to individuals and companies and making government support based on performance in a competitive environment, this kind of mechanism had a huge cumulative effect. So that was the critical combination that was important. And the strategy for growth and structural transformation for Korea, as I mentioned, was quite similar to earlier industrializers, except for the fact that Korea, with a small domestic market, relied much more heavily on international trade. So use international trade to relax critical constraints like food. If you cannot produce enough food for your population, you may have to find some ways to import or take hold of food. Employment, if your economy is not strong enough to support full employment with decent jobs, you may have to find some international trade and other opportunities overseas to generate employment, money, finance, and technology. And overall, the basic strategy is to improve factor endowments, basically people, and infrastructure, and so on, in such a way to develop capabilities in income elastic and productivity increasing sectors. I emphasize this because many countries have some success initially in low productivity segments of, say, labor-intensive manufacturing, like garments. Okay? But if you stay there, okay, for instance, demand for cheap garments is not going to increase that much with rising income. Okay? And productivity enhancing potential of low-end garment sector is limited. So what you like to do is to develop human capital, human resources, so that you'll be able to, so that you'll excel in income elastic and productivity increasing sectors. Okay, so you like to consciously go for structural transformation and industrial upgrading on a cumulative basis. Okay, so that was the key strategy. And let me now list some key events and policies. Okay. Right after the liberation of Korea from the Japanese colonial rule, there was wealth redistribution to make meritocracy credible, performance-based reward and discipline mechanism credible. First, of course, was the collapse of traditional social hierarchy in the early 20th century and under the Japanese colonial rule. But more importantly, there was a land reform in 1950, and there was also the Korean War that basically put just about everybody at the same starting line. Okay? And people could credibly expect that their hard work and hard study would pay off in a society that's not rigidly defined by a social hierarchy, traditional social hierarchy. Okay? And this had a huge impact on education and training, because if you think about it, if student believes that his or her effort is not going to pay off because he or she is from a lower class and the society is very rigid in that regard, there's going to be a limit to how much he or she puts effort into her schoolwork. Right? So when this initial wealth redistribution made meritocracy credible, and it was combined with a revolution in human resource development, a huge increase in education in the 1950s, there was a big impact on the potential of the Korean society. Okay? These two things were very important, and in many ways were really not available options when Korea was under the Japanese colonial rule, because Japanese colonial regime basically tried to maintain order by co-opting landlords and so on, and also it's not the task of the colonial authority to educate the colonized people. Right? So there was a limit to how much you could have things like land reform and educational reform under the colonial rule, but things changed quite dramatically after Korea's liberation. Okay? Even then, because of political turbulence and corruption that had a negative impact on society, there was not much tangible progress as far as economic results were concerned. And in the early 1960s, there were two huge changes in political economy. One is the student revolution that happened on April 19th in 1960 that overthrew the previous corrupt government. And the second huge political event is the military coup that took place on May 16th in 1961. These two events basically had a huge impact on rent-seeking activities that had prevailed in the 1950s and had the effect of channeling Korea's national energy into modernization, especially economic modernization. And after some trial and error, Korea shifted to export-oriented industrialization in 1964-65. And then, with some success in early industrialization, especially in labor-intensive manufacturing, that built on the human capital that had accumulated in the 1950s, thanks to the land reform and educational reform, Korea then tried to address some social cohesion issues by investing in complementary rural development. I mentioned Saemal-Undong already. And then, at the same time, Korea tried to push for industrial upgrading and innovation. And as these efforts progressed, export-oriented industrialization, complementary rural development, and industrial upgrading, things began to change very rapidly. Okay? Now, as the economy was growing, yes, there were some people who were left behind. But Korea tried to stay away from European-style universal welfare state and instead provide social protection only for those who truly need it. Okay? So these are the key events and policies that defined Korea's development experience. And let me now go to each of these events and policies. Okay. Land reform. This graph shows Korea's tenancy rate in dark blue color and rice production in light blue color. Okay. As you can see, tenancy rate before 1950 land reform was well over 50% under the Japanese colonial rule, and it was still close to 40 to 45% in 1950. Okay. Now, what happened was deeply political in nature. Okay. After Korea's liberation from the Japanese colonial rule in 1945, Korea was divided in two halves. The north was occupied by the Soviet forces. The south was occupied by American forces. And in North Korea, under a communist regime, there was a very drastic land reform. So basically, the government took away land from landlords and provided free of charge this land to the peasants. Okay? And this had a huge impact on peasants in South Korea. Okay? At this time, each year, peasants were paying something like 50% of their annual crop as a fee to the landlords. Okay? And given that the land reform was going on in North Korea, people began to demand a similar land reform in Korea. Okay? But as a capitalist economy, South Korea wasn't going to offer zero compensation to landlords. And what happened was this. As landlords became more and more uneasy about an impending land reform, they began selling their land. So land prices began dropping. Okay? And by 1950, land price was close to something like 1.5 times annual crop output. So the government said, if you own any land, any agricultural land beyond about 3 hectares, okay, you have to sell that land to the government, okay, and the government will give you government bonds. Okay, and peasants, in turn, could buy land from the government by promising to pay 1.5 times annual crop over a 5-year period. So it's a installment plan, 5 annual installments of 30% each. It's a quite moderate price given the political circumstance. And the thing was, it was politically motivated domestically as well, because the first president of South Korea, Syngman Rhee, did not have a strong domestic base, and he faced some opposition from large landlords, and he felt land reform was a great way to weaken potential domestic opposition. So this confluence events resulted in a very revolutionary land reform without causing bloodshed or major troubles. And the government bonds that landlords got for selling their excess land fell in value drastically due to wartime inflation. Recall that the land reform took place in the spring of 1950, and Korean War occurred in June of 1950. Okay. So as a result, there was a lot of wealth redistribution through this land reform. And it gave a positive incentive to peasants to improve their crop output. So although they didn't have agricultural machinery or huge irrigation facilities, things of that nature, but they put in a lot of hours, working hours, producing compost, applying them, and trying to increase yields. And as you can see, rice production increased after the land reform, even without much mechanical or chemical input provided by the government or by the market. So that was an important change in the 1950s. The other important change I mentioned was the educational reform. Okay. In 1950, Korea instituted universal primary education. And as you can see from this graph, people or students enrolled in elementary school, marked by blue color, went from something like 2 million to 4 million over the 1950s. So enrollment basically doubled. Okay? And at other levels of education, too, enrollment increased quite sharply. Okay? But as you see with the brown color, which shows real GDP per capita, there wasn't much improvement. While enrollment doubled, real GDP per capita did not increase much. In fact, it required some complementary changes in industrial and trade policy to have real impact on real per capita income. But the bottom line is that Korea was producing an increasing number of well-educated people, okay, available at cheap wages, given stagnant real per capita income, and basically was creating a comparative advantage in labor-intensive manufacturing, even though Korea did not utilize this comparative advantage very wisely in the 1950s. So the land reform combined with the education reform set the stage for takeoff in the 1960s, which tends to be somewhat underappreciated. Okay. Now, I mentioned huge political changes in the early 1960s, the student revolution in 1960 and military coup in 1961. And as a result of these political changes, what came to be known as Korea's Big Push Partnership was created, partnership between the government and business groups. Okay? And basically, this model contained 3 key elements. The first is the two-tier approach to coordination and innovation. The government drafts national level development plan and tries to coordinate economic activities and provide support for R&D and other innovative activities. But these are sort of indicative plans. The government is not instituting, say, communist command economy, command economy, and trying to dictate what each factory and individual must do, but rather it is presenting a blueprint. Okay, and as far as implementation is concerned, group level, on the ground coordination and innovation challenges were met by business groups. Business groups like Samsung and Hyundai in the private sector, especially in manufacturing, and business groups like KEPCO, Korea Electric Power Corporation, in the infrastructure sector, in a state-owned enterprise in the infrastructure sector, and the government and business groups engaged in consultation on an extensive level and shared information and risks. So that was the first defining feature of the Korean model. The second defining feature was active use of international trade. Okay. Now, if you are a poor country, you are not going to be able to produce everything. Okay. So to that extent, say, even if you want to make a bicycle, you're not going to produce sophisticated gears and brakes and so on. So you have to rely on imports to mitigate some coordination problems when you don't have the capacity to produce everything and coordinate economic activities. In addition, if you have a small market, by relying on trade, you can take advantage of scale economies. Okay? Otherwise, if you do not engage in exports and international trade, you are just going to be limited to the small domestic market. And more dynamically, international trade also offers a market test and performance-based reward mechanism as well. So, say the government says, we are going to provide export financing at a low interest rate to companies that do a great job in international markets. You're setting up a mechanism that rewards performance. Okay? Think about the other case where government support is based on so-called performance in the domestic market only, which is much more susceptible to political influence and manipulation. Okay? And finally, international trade also offers opportunities for learning. If you are going to engage in international trade, you better know what major players, what your rival firms are doing, and if they are doing something better than you, you better learn. Okay? So there's a motivation device, upgrading mechanism as well. Finally, the third element of the Korean model included the containment of corruption and rent-seeking. Okay. At the outset, I emphasized that a strong state could engage in arbitrary distribution of resources, allocation of resources. So how do you contain corruption and rent-seeking? And I think it was important that there was the student revolution that overthrew a previously corrupt government first in 1960, okay? And made more productive activities profitable than rent-seeking activities overall, and also had the effect of putting some checks on the use of government power. Okay? In addition, there was administrative reform. For instance, after the student revolution, civil service exams were introduced in Korea. Written national level civil service exams were introduced. Prior to that, government officials were recruited on the basis of interviews. Okay? And interviews could be distorted to a great degree by social ties. Okay? But by introducing a written examination, which offers same opportunity, whether you are a very well-connected person or a poorly connected person, you emphasize meritocracy in government employee recruiting. In addition, monitoring was tightened on government officials. And finally, some incentives were given as well. So government employee pension was introduced in 1963. This was 25 years before the introduction of national pension for everybody. And basically, it offered a decent, after retirement life for government employees. Okay? But if you engage in corruption as a government official, okay, and convicted, then you lose the government employee pension. Okay? So these incentives and disincentives were set up so as to contain corruption and rent-seeking as well. Okay? Now, one of the key challenges at first for Korea in the early 1960s was how to finance development. Okay? Where to get the money. Okay? Korea was a poor country at the time, so how do you attract foreign capital? Now, in Korea's case, it knew it had to rely on foreign capital in the early stages of development. But instead of relying heavily on foreign direct investment, it used foreign loans to a much greater degree. Because foreign direct investment risks losing ownership of your development. Okay? Now, if you use loans, and if you cannot pay back the loans, then you get into serious trouble. Okay? But if you do a good job of selecting investment projects and using performance-based reward mechanism, then you may be able to generate investment return that is higher than the opportunity cost of capital. So basically, what Korea was doing was looking at the interest rate differential between domestic interest rate, which was very high, and the international interest rate, much lower, and trying to find investment projects and profitable opportunities to pay back the loans and generate a surplus capital. Okay? And this process went on. So in the first 5-year economic development plan period, from 1962 to 66, as you can see, foreign savings accounted for more than 50% of investment in Korea. Okay, so Korea relied very heavily on foreign capital. But as Korea generated profits using both domestic and foreign capital and accumulating wealth this way, by 1977, 1981, foreign savings accounted for only 18.1% of overall investment, and domestic savings now accounted for or increased to 25% of GNP. So you are accumulating domestic capital by generating good returns on projects carefully selected through performance-based reward and discipline mechanism. Okay. And in addition, as domestic capital accumulated, the Korean government tried to enhance domestic resource mobilization. Okay. Prior to this, not only was Korea poor, but there was a lot of petty corruption in tax collection, so on. So in 1966, tax revenue service was completely overhauled, and reforms were introduced. And as you can see here, government revenue, colored in blue color, as percent of GDP, increased very sharply in a relatively short period. So basically, they prevented tax evasion by introducing administrative reform and rooting out petty corruption, but also try to persuade people to pay taxes, especially large companies to pay taxes, because these large companies were also the big beneficiaries of rapid economic development. Okay. So by having greater domestic resource mobilization, the Korean government now relied less on foreign capital and foreign aid, and thus acquired more policy space to pursue its own policy. Okay. Now, I emphasize that there was a major shift to export-oriented industrialization in 1964-65, and this graph highlights this change. Back in 1953, as you can see here, exports as percent of GDP in Korea was very low. In the 1950s overall, exports as percent of GDP was less than 5%. Okay. Korea wasn't producing much exports. And by contrast, imports as percent of GDP was on the order of about 25% in the 1950s. And the gap between the two, exports and imports, was basically financed by non-merchandise trade, things like the money Korea got from UN troops stationed in Korea, and also financial assistance it received from the United States. Okay. In fact, foreign aid accounted for about 8% of gross domestic product in the 1950s. Okay. Now, in the early 1960s, there were some garment companies, plywood companies that were beginning to have some success in the international market, and the government took note of this. Okay. And it switched to export-oriented industrialization policy instead of import substituting heavy industrialization policy that it had pursued previously. And exports increased very sharply. So exports as percent of GDP increased from about 5% of GDP, 5% in 1965 to about 10% in 1970. And increased further in the 1970s and 80s onward. Now, exports as percent of GDP is a ratio, and as you can see, if this ratio was going to increase this much, it has to increase. Exports have to increase much sharper, much faster than GDP. Okay? In fact, annually, exports are increasing something like 30% to 40%. So instead of just trying to rely on foreign aid, okay, and get money from troops stationed in Korea, and engaging in a lot of rent-seeking in terms of getting hold of aid materials and so on, Korea switched to export-oriented industrialization in the early 1960s and used that as a key mechanism to drive economic development process. First with labor-intensive manufacturers, garments, plywood, wigs, and so on. But with industrial upgrading, more sophisticated products became exports, became top exports for Korea, like electronics. Okay? And at this time, international trading environment was much more friendly to developing countries. It allowed developing countries to retain some tariffs and other measures to protect the domestic market. And Korea took full advantage of it. Okay, so it joined the GATT, the precursor to WTO in 1967, and liberalized some import restrictions and so on. But as Korea upgraded its, tried to upgrade its industrial structure, it once again introduced tariff measures to protect especially heavy and chemical industries, and also to discourage conspicuous consumption. So export-oriented industrialization was very strategic in this regard. Okay? And as rural areas were relatively falling behind as industrialization was going on in urban areas, a complementary rural development program was introduced. Okay? And the background was the widening urban-rural income gap. Okay? In the early 1960s, there was hardly any difference between urban and rural income, but by the late 1960s, about 3% income gap had developed between urban and rural areas. Okay? So to address this, something had to be done. Okay? But government officials and experts knew that if you're just handing out money to poor farmers, Okay? It's not going to be the best way to motivate them to better themselves. So Saemaulundong, literally meaning New Village Movement, was introduced in 1970 with some creative ideas. Okay? The movement, the New Village Movement, or Saemaulundong, contained three core elements. The first is community empowerment, okay, under the motto of diligence, self-help, and cooperation. Self-help was emphasized. Basically, if you cannot help yourself, the government is not going to help you. So what was done was to encourage local decision-making on things like community improvement projects. Also, there was an effort to encourage voluntary contributions from villages. I mean, it's their village after all, their own village after all. The second key element was pure inspiration, pure learning and inspiration. Basically, some villages with similar endowments were doing better than others. Some villages somehow motivated their villagers to improve their community with a new town hall, new bridge, and so on. Other communities with similar endowments did not do so well. So what the government did was to set up a training center and introduce study tours and training sessions so that villagers could learn from each other. Okay? Basically, the government classified all rural villages into three categories. Basic, the poorest performing villages, self-help in the middle, and self-reliant, the best performing villages, and try to inspire villagers, especially poorly performing villagers, by having them interact with better performing villages. Okay? And after this study tour and training session, they were asked to reflect on the experience and jot down what they are going to do after they go back to their own village. And things like that had a huge impact. Rather than dictating to villages what they should do, having their peers, their own peers motivate them was much more effective. And finally, the third core element was performance-based support from the government. In 1970, the government provided each of 33,000 rural villages with cement, construction materials, and let each village decide their best use for the good of the community. So some village decided to build a town hall with this. Some decided to build a bridge with this, with labor coming in from villages themselves, okay, voluntarily. But other villages did not do anything with the free construction materials. And next year, in 1971, the government provided more cement and things like reinforced steel to only those villages that had achieved good results in the first year. Okay? So the ones that did not do anything, that had not done anything in 1970, did not receive additional support. Okay? And on things like rural electrification, providing electricity to rural villages, the best performing villages were favored. So, you reward good performance rather than give handouts to poorly performing villages. So that was the basic idea. And combined with this Saemaulundong were other programs that were important. First was agricultural infrastructure improvement program, things like building multipurpose dams and providing electricity. In addition, Green Revolution and Silver Revolution. The first has to do with the introduction of newly improved varieties, seeds, and so on. And the second, Silver Revolution, had to do with the introduction of greenhouses covered with silvery vinyl, and allowed people to grow vegetables and fruits out of season. And finally, the government even introduced a dual grain price system where the government would procure grains like rice and barley at a higher price than they subsequently sold to urban workers. Now, dual grain price system as structured produces a fiscal deficit, right? But the government felt, given the huge income gap between urban and rural areas, some emergency measures like this were needed to address social cohesion issues. And after achieving, greatly narrowing and eliminating the urban-rural income gap, this dual grain price system was phased out. Okay. So complementary rural development was very important, not only in improving rural productivity, agricultural productivity, but also maintaining and enhancing social cohesion. Okay. Now, the other side of the effort was, as I emphasized, industrial upgrading. So Korea didn't stay just with garments and footwear and other light manufacturing, labor-intensive products, but went on to more sophisticated industries. And here, Korea took some chance. Okay, basically, it benchmarked countries like Japan with similar natural endowments as Korea. So, you have not only few natural resources, but people are plentiful. And by increasing human capital, enhancing human capital, you can go into more sophisticated industries. And by looking at the path traveled by countries like Japan, Korea could reasonably believe that it had some fighting chance in more sophisticated industries, even when at the time there was hardly any presence of these sophisticated manufacturing plants at the time. Okay? And greatly supplementing that industrial upgrading effort was innovation, investing in R&D, research and development. And here too, performance-based reward mechanism operated as well. Because Korean companies like Samsung and Hyundai and LG were exposed to global competition, and private sector companies quickly came to realize that innovation was key to their continued prosperity and dramatically increased their R&D expenditures. So if you look at Korea's R&D expenditures, you see a remarkable pattern. Okay? Back in 1970, Korea's overall gross R&D expenditure was less than 0.5% of GDP. So it didn't spend much money on research and development. And about 80% of R&D expenditure was undertaken by public bodies, like government research institutes. And private sector did not spend much money on R&D in 1970. But because private sector companies were exposed to global competition and they were going into more sophisticated industries like shipbuilding, machinery, electronics, petrochemicals, and so on, they greatly increased their own R&D expenditures, okay, set up their own R&D labs and so on. And by 1982, you see that private sector R&D caught up with the public sector R&D. Okay? And overall, Korea's gross R&D expenditure reached about 1% of GDP. And these days, or by the 2000s, private sector R&D was about 3 times public sector R&D. And overall, Korea's gross R&D expenditure amounted to about 3% of GDP. Now, that's a very different pattern from countries that are stuck in middle-income trap, so-called. Okay? You initially successful in early industrialization with some labor-intensive manufacturing, food processing, and so on. But then you don't spend much money on R&D. So you don't really get to upgrade your economic structure, and you're kind of stuck there. Okay? And in 2010, if you look at the international landscape for R&D, it's striking in this regard. Countries like Indonesia and Mexico that had some success with economic development basically spend not much. They do not spend much money on R&D. It's less than 0.5% of GDP. Okay? Back in Korea's 1970 level. And by 2010, by contrast, South Korea, is here, was spending about 3.5% of GDP in terms of R&D expenditure. And these days, Korea spends in excess of 4% of GDP on R&D. So it's a very different picture on how to sustain growth and development through a structural transformation. And this structural transformation presents itself in Korea's change in sectoral shares. If you look at agriculture and mining, manufacturing and services, Korea was basically an agriculture and mining country in the 1950s. Okay? And manufacturing accounted for about 10% of GDP. Okay? And it didn't change much in the early 1960s. But as Korea shifted to export-oriented industrialization and took advantage of its strengths in labor-intensive manufacturing first, it increased its manufacturing share of GDP to 20% by 1969. And as Korea moved into more sophisticated sectors, heavy and chemical sectors, manufacturing share increased further to 25% and 30% by 1989. Okay. By contrast, agriculture and mining share dropped dramatically. Okay, so there was a great deal of structural transformation in a very short period. And this manifests itself in Korea's top 10 export list. Okay. Back in 1960, as I emphasized, Korea exported less than 5% equivalent of its GDP. And its top 3 export items were iron ore, tungsten ore, and raw silk. There was some cuttlefish and live fish thrown in there for sophisticated Japanese consumers. But there wasn't much manufacturing product at all in 1960. By 1970, 10 years later, labor-intensive manufacturing products like textiles, plywood, and wigs had become top 3 export items for Korea. Okay. By 1980, in addition to labor-intensive manufacturing products like textiles, electronics and iron and steel products came to the fore. By 1990, sophisticated manufacturing products like electronics had become #1 export product, supplemented by labor-intensive manufacturers. But by this time, Korea was losing its comparative advantage in labor-intensive manufacturing to countries like China and Vietnam. So by 2000, labor-intensive manufacturing products get pushed out. Textiles is #9 by this time. And top 3 items in 2000 were dominated by semiconductors, computers, and automobiles. And by 2010, you have top 3 items being semiconductors, ships, and phones. So in a relatively short time, I tried to present some key features of Korea's development experience. I showed you per capita GDP in comparative context, poverty rate. But what I'd like to emphasize is the path that Korea traveled wasn't all that different from advanced industrial countries like Germany, France, the United States, and so on. And the one distinguishing feature is the use of international trade to a much greater degree. But the key to this overall is having a state effective enough to maintain stability and address coordination and innovation challenges on the one hand, and the use of performance-based reward and discipline mechanism. So you assure equality of opportunity, try to assure equality of opportunity, but you give more reward, okay, to people and firms who do better in performance, be it in export markets or in rural community projects, and try to build on it that way. And as far as strategy is concerned, you actively use international trade to address some deficiencies, but the key focus has to be on building capabilities in income elastic and productivity enhancing sectors on a cumulative basis. And backing all this is a huge political change. Okay, I mentioned the political background of land reform, educational reform, as well as a shift to export-oriented industrialization. And without such, sacrifice and efforts from common people calling for more political freedom as well as economic development, the so-called the Korean miracle would not have happened. I hope I didn't take up too much of your time, and I hope you enjoy your dinner finally. Thank you.